This is another one of those really strange stories in the Bible, but it hits a theme that is almost universal, which is life's not fair. And that's not fair. There's a lot of things in this story that are not fair. Now, I'm going to say a couple introductory things here before we get into it. One is that I really believe as you read this story, chapters 29 and 30 in Genesis, that it's meant to be read almost as a comedy. There's a lot of humor here, and a comedy not in the sense of trivializing. These two chapters deal with some very, very serious issues. Everything from sibling rivalry to deception and competition within a family to infertility and to the struggles of how do we live and how to relate and how do we connect and how do we see ourselves in relation to God and others when we want to have children but can't have children. These are very serious topics. And by saying they're comedy, I don't mean that it treats them as trivial. The best comedy deals with very serious things and helps us look at and examine very serious things in a serious way, but also with some laughter involved. And sometimes that laughter, like Mary Poppins says, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, and sometimes that laughter really helps us absorb some hard lessons in the tough realities of life. And the fact that life isn't fair is one of those tough realities. And I got to think that there were a lot of people in these two chapters that were saying, that's not fair. That's not fair. Well, let's talk about the story, the strangest wedding story that I know of anyway. When Jacob says to Laban, his uncle, we think, somewhere around there, some sort of kin relationship there with his mother. I think it's his uncle. And he says, I want to marry your younger daughter, Rachel. She's beautiful. I love her. Let's get married. I'll work 7 years for her. And Laban says, fine, that's great. Works 7 years. 7 years later, the wedding comes. And at that night, and I don't know, I got to think there was alcohol involved. I got to think there was maybe a veil being worn somewhere along the way. But when it's time for the honeymoon to begin, Laban sends his daughter Leah instead of his daughter Rachel into Jacob's tent. And that gives rise to what I think might be the funniest verse in the entire Bible, which is, when the morning came, there was Leah. And I got to think, Jacob said, this isn't fair. This isn't fair. And he went to Laban, you've deceived me. Now, there's part of us that can say, well, what goes around comes around. Karma going on here. I'm not really a karma person, but, the reason Jacob is here anyway is because he deceived his father into giving him his brother's blessing. And now Jacob is being deceived. And again, there's a lot of names for that. In the Bible, we talk about it being the principle of sowing and reaping. You reap what you sow. And Jacob has reaped a life of deception, and now he's getting deceived. And he's not happy about it. On the receiving end, he's not happy about it. But Laban says, it's just tradition around here. And you can't marry the younger daughter before the older one's been married. So I tell you what, work another 7 years, you can marry Rachel. Didn't make him wait. He just made him wait a week. Finish your week with Leah, and then I'll give you Rachel. So Jacob gets married for the second time a week later. And now he has 2 wives, and each of his wives has a female maidservant. And it's clear that Jacob loves Rachel. Leah, not so much. Leah could say, that's not fair. That's not fair. But God saw that Leah was not loved as much as Rachel. And so God blessed Leah, and she conceived. Well, yeah, that's not fair. I'm jumping ahead. Life isn't fair. I already said that. God sees, and God is faithful. God sees Leah and her distress. And it really wasn't fair. We don't really know what the relationship between Leah and Rachel is. We don't know whether they were friends. We do know that they were rivals. We see that rivalry going on in the next chapter. We'll talk about that a little bit here too. But we know that Jacob loved Rachel more than he loved Leah, and we see that that's not fair, and we see that God sees that. Leah didn't ask for this. Leah's put in the middle of this. I can't imagine what was going through her head when her dad says, hey, why don't you go? I'll keep Rachel in the tent at home. And I have no idea what was going on in Leah's head when he sent Leah in Rachel's place. But now she's married, and her husband is also married to her younger sister, and he loves her more than he loves her sister more than he loves her. And God sees Leah in this situation, a situation that as far as we know, she didn't ask for, she didn't desire, she's in, and it's not fair. And God doesn't make the situation go away, but God sees and God blesses Leah. God makes her fertile. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And it didn't stop there, because she conceived and she conceived and she conceived. She had 4 sons, gave birth to 4 sons for her husband Jacob. Still, Rachel has not gotten pregnant. But then Leah didn't get pregnant again either at that time. And so she says, gotta keep going here. So, Rachel, who couldn't get pregnant, says, well, I'm not getting pregnant. So she goes to her maid and says, hey, Bilhah, you want to have a baby with my husband? Bilhah says, all right, sounds good to me. She goes in and she gets pregnant and she has a son. And then she gets pregnant again and she has another son. And so now Jacob has 6 sons, 4 by Leah, 2 by Bilhah. And Leah's going, I got to get back in the game here. So Leah says to her servant Zilpah, hey, you want to have a baby with my husband? He's like, all right. I'm thinking Jacob must have been good looking. I don't see how this would have worked if Jacob wasn't good looking and reasonably, more than reasonably attractive. So what's that? Probably had hair. That's low. That's low. Oh my goodness. It's not fair. So Zilpah gets pregnant. She has a son. And then she gets pregnant again, and she has another son. So now Jacob has 8 sons, 4 by Leah, 4 by Bilhah, or 2 by Bilhah, 2 by Zilpah. And at this point, and again, this is years are passing here. Rachel still has not conceived, still has not had a child. And Reuben, the oldest son, Jacob's firstborn, Leah's firstborn, is out in the fields doing whatever he's doing in the fields, and he discovers some mandrake plants. Mandrakes, if you're watching Harry Potter, they are not going to kill anybody. In the ancient world, and this is well documented in that region in the ancient world, mandrakes were believed to be both aphrodisiacs and aids to fertility. And so Leah's son discovers some mandrake plants and brings them back. And Rachel sees the mandrakes. And she's like, this isn't fair. I want to have a baby. And so she goes to Leah and says, hey, tell your son to give me the mandrakes, or to give me some of the mandrakes, which gives rise to the second funniest and maybe the strangest verse in the Bible. Rachel, the strangest verse in the Bible, which is, but she said to her, wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too? This is Leah's response. Bad enough you stole my husband's affection, my husband's heart, you're going to take my son's mandrakes too. But Rachel wants the mandrakes because she wants to get pregnant. And Leah says, all right, you can have the mandrakes, but I get Jacob tonight. And so Jacob comes in from the fields, and Leah comes up to him and says, hey, you're sleeping with me tonight. I bought you for some mandrakes. Check it. That's exactly what she says. It's right there in the Bible. Jacob goes in, sleeps with Leah. Boom, she's pregnant. Again. Rachel still not so much. And then Leah gets pregnant one more time. 6 sons she's now had for Jacob. And Rachel is still barren. And then finally, we are told this, that God then remembered Rachel, and he listened to her, and he enabled her to conceive. And Rachel gave birth to Joseph. The Technicolor Dreamcoat Joseph, the Joseph who saved his people from starvation and gave them a place in Egypt. We'll get to Joseph later. But this was Joseph's origin story here. All of these things happen. And all along the way, it's possible to say, it's not fair. It's not fair. It wasn't fair for Leah. It wasn't really fair for Rachel either to not be able to have a baby just because her husband preferred her to her sister. And in all of this, God sees. Life isn't fair. This is, I think, one of the most important lessons we can teach our children, is that life isn't fair. I think that that's one of the reasons why the internet is such a hot mess and social media is such a hot mess, is because there's a lot of folks that don't get that life just isn't fair. And God doesn't seem to be interested in making it fair, as much as God is interested in justice. And that is a theme throughout the Scripture. Justice for the poor, justice for the needy, for the vulnerable, for the orphan, for the widow, and for the foreigner. Justice for all folks. God doesn't seem particularly interested in making life fair. But God sees. In the middle of the unfairness, God sees. Now, I don't know what unfairness is going on in your life right now. And unfairness can come from a lot of different directions. Unfairness can come at work, being treated differently for the wrong reasons or whatever. Unfairness can come in school. Unfairness can come in personal relationships. It can seem that way in your family. Anyone with young children that hasn't heard the phrase, "that's not fair," in the past week? Unfairness comes all over the place. Unfairness comes in natural abilities. Some people have to have hair. Yeah, there, right? God made a few perfect heads, the rest He covered with hair. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. When life seems really, really unfair, God invites us to look for His blessing. Because even when life is unfair, God is not blind. God sees. God notices. And look for God's blessing. And I don't mean that to trivialize the realities of unfairness. Again, one of the major themes of these two chapters is infertility. And that alone can be very devastating to couples, women and men both. And it can be emotionally, socially, relationally, psychologically, and spiritually devastating. And I don't mean to trivialize that by saying, well, God will, if God closes a door, He'll open a window, or if God takes away one blessing, He'll give you another. It's not simplistic like that. Sometimes we have to really look for the blessing. Sometimes the blessing doesn't come for years. Joseph, who was sold by his brothers into slavery, said, this isn't fair. And it was years later, probably decades later, before he was able to see the blessing that was in all of that and through all of that. One of the extraordinary things about our God, and I think this is captured in the word redemption. God doesn't make everything fair, but God will redeem the unfairness. And one of the things about redemption is it isn't just fixing something. It's not just taking a broken thing and mending it. It's redemption is resurrection. It's a new life, but it's not just a restoration of the old life. When Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, it wasn't a resurrection. He just restored his whole old life, and that life continued much as it had before. When Jesus is resurrected from the dead and the resurrection that we await, it's a new life. And it's different in some way. And we don't know exactly how it will be. We just know that we're going to be like Jesus because we'll see Him as He is. But we know that after that resurrection, Jesus was like He could be in one place and then another. That He had scars, but He wasn't bound by the scars. He had an incredible amount of peace, amazing power. There's glory, Paul says, awaiting for us in the resurrection. It's a new life. It's a different life. And it's a life that God gives us back. And in redemption, God makes the moment and then going forward better than it would have been had it not been for the pain and the sorrow and the unfairness. I'm not saying that very well. When we go through a bad thing, maybe a horrible breakup, maybe a life-shattering illness, maybe the death of a loved one. On the other side of that, God has the power to make life even better than it was before, even better than it would have been had the bad thing not happened. And that's a thing that's difficult for us to wrap our brains around. Because it doesn't mean that God wants the bad things to happen to us. Doesn't mean that we should want unfairness to happen to ourselves or to happen to those we love. Well, just because then, what it means is that somehow God has the ability to make life better even than it would have been. God did that. He did it for Rachel. He did it for Leah. He did it for Zilpah and Bilhah and all of this too. Did it for Jacob. Did it for Joseph. He did it for Jesus, and He'll do that for us. So when we go through those unfair times, when we are experiencing those things, when we're in the middle of them, it's worth stopping and pausing, or God invites us to stop and pause. And remember that God sees, that we're not lost to God in that. And then to look for that blessing, however it may come and whenever it may come. Here's a simple fact. We really don't want God to be fair. We really don't. If God were fair, it would not go well with anybody. There's another great story of unfairness in the Bible, and it's a story that Jesus told of the prodigal son. Remember that? Yeah, and the one son, the older son, who was dutiful and obedient and loyal and faithful to his father all through his life. And then the younger son, who was kind of a scoundrel and a wastrel, just a knucklehead that took everything his father gave him and wasted and found himself destitute in a foreign land. And he had squandered his inheritance. He had insulted his father horribly by asking for his inheritance before his father died. When he said that, culturally, he was in effect saying, Father, I wish you were dead. Give me my inheritance now. And he takes that inheritance and he squanders it all. And then he comes back, and you know the story. The father sees him from a distance, and the father runs out to greet him, and he welcomes him, and he puts his robe on him, puts his ring on his finger, has the fatted calf killed, and he has a big feast to welcome his son home. And his older son comes back and sees what's going on and says, that's not fair. That's not fair. I've always been faithful. I've always been working for you. You haven't had this kind of party for me, but this son of yours who's wasted your wealth, shamed you and our whole family, you're throwing a feast and a celebration for him. It's not fair. And the father says, but my son was lost and he's found. He was dead to me and now he's alive again. And we're going to celebrate that. And he invites the older son. He doesn't say, he just invites, he said, come in. Celebrate with us. And the story's left open-ended. We don't know whether the older son goes in or not. We don't know whether he joins in the celebration or he stays outside pouting about life being unfair. But the good news is if God insisted on fairness, that younger son would never have gotten welcomed home. The younger son would never have been forgiven. The younger son would never have been restored and redeemed. But because our God allows and sanctions and at times even blesses unfairness, he was restored and he was redeemed. And because of that, we can be too. That one day we can and will be welcomed home by God, who will receive us as his sons and daughters, even when we failed, even when we've sinned, even when we've wasted good things that God has given to us, even when we've spent a lot of time moaning and groaning about how unfair life is. When we return to God, God receives us. and will make our life even better than it would have been had we never left before, had we never fallen away. And that's not fair. That's not fair. But it's good news for all of us. I can tell you what wasn't fair. Jesus dying on the cross was not fair. Jesus, the only truly sinless person, the only completely and wholly good person to ever live, hung on the cross, abused and rejected and shamed and scorned by the very people that he was giving life and breath to at that very moment. And they were using that gift of life and breath to kill the one who gave it to them. And they stripped him, and they put a crown of thorn on his heads, and they threw him down on the cross, and they drove nails into his hands and his feet, and they hung him up there in the air to die, publicly shamed and disgraced. That wasn't fair. That wasn't fair that Jesus' body was broken in that way, and it wasn't fair that Jesus' blood was shed. That the one who said life is in the blood poured out his life's blood for all humanity. That the one who has blessed us with the love of family and friends and children and snow and sunshine and rain should see his blood fall to the ground, hanging from a cross. But Jesus did that, and he did that willingly, so that we could be redeemed, so that somehow life will be better, not only better after Jesus' crucifixion, but better than it would have been had Jesus never been rejected and crucified. How God does that, I don't know. That's the power of a mighty God to redeem and to save. And fairness has nothing to do with it. One of my favorite movies, this doesn't really, I'll go there anyway. I got a couple extra minutes, might as well use it. One of my favorite movies is Unforgiven. You ever seen that? It's an old Clint Eastwood movie. If you haven't seen Unforgiven, watch Unforgiven. Got one of the best lines in movie history. So Will Money is Clint Eastwood's character, and he's the anti-hero. He's a bad guy that's trying to change and finds himself going out on one more bad deed to try to save his starving family. And his good friend gets killed in the process, and he gets killed by Little Bill, who's the sheriff of the town. And Little Bill is supposed to be the good guy, but he's not really a good guy. And Will comes back to seek his revenge. And he walks into the bar and he kills a bunch of folks and he wounds Little Bill, and Little Bill's lying there on the ground, and William Money walks up to him and he loads his shotgun one more time and he points it down at him. And Little Bill says, "It's not fair. I was building a house." And Will Money looks at him and says, "Fair's got nothing to do with it." And he kills him. It's not a Jesus thing to do, right? We can all agree on that. That's not the takeaway from this. The takeaway from this is that God, with a polar opposite attitude, looks at us and says, "Fair's got nothing to do with it." Nothing to do with it. For Will Money, it was revenge. For God, it's redemption. It's love. It's forgiveness. And fair's got nothing to do with it. Let's pray together.